Well, good morning. I'll tell you what, if that was a movie trailer, I would want to go see that movie, right? I think it's exciting what we're talking about, what we're heading into as we kind of work our way through this idea of what could the church look like? What are we being called to? How do we as a church represent Christ here on earth? And so we're continuing this series, the church, separation of church and hate. So thank you so much for being here with us. If you're here live just right now, we appreciate you making part of a day. If you're watching online, thank you. If you're at Elmira Wesleyan, our sister church there, thank you as well as we work our way through this idea. There's some old letters that you can read. You can actually go on Google, if you wanted to. You don't do it right now, but you can find them. They're in books. And it's letters from a guy named Emperor Julian. And his nickname is Julian the Apostate, which basically means Julian the pagan heretic, right? So I don't know who gave him that name. It was his mom. I don't know where the nickname came from. We have no documented whether he liked said nickname. But that's what he's called. And he's writing about Christians. And he doesn't like Christians very much. But the reasons he doesn't like Christians may very well surprise you. See, Christianity was exploding on the scene during this time. It was growing exponentially faster than the religions of Rome. And Julian starts to write his priests and his religious leaders and his political leaders. And this is basically what he says. He said, listen, if we're going to compete with the Christians, we've got to look more like them. Right? He says, if we're going to grow faster, the Christians are doing some things that we need to replicate. He says, not only are the Christians taking care of their own poor, but they're taking care of our poor. Not only are you doing that, but when we take a baby, this is a common practice, an unwanted child, they would take it out to the trash heap. And the Romans would leave it there to die from overexposure. And when they would do that, the Christians would come in and they would take this baby and they would bring it into their homes and they would love that child like it was their own. And he's like, we've got to start thinking about this stuff. Christians, he says, they treat foreigners like brothers and sisters. They don't care if someone's a Roman citizen or not. They treat people that look differently than them, that live differently than them, that believe differently than them. They treat them well. And then he calls them, he says they have a fake piety. And what he means by that is, he says there's no way that these Christians are actually as good as they perceive to be. There's no way that anyone could actually live a life that good. So he writes about the foolish, atheistic, impious Galileans. Atheistic because they don't believe in the Romans' God, and impious because he says there's no way they could actually live this well. And he concludes by saying, if we want to grow our power and get it back, something's got to change. We have to look more like them. And what I want to ask you today, and the question that's been going through my head is, as soon as Pastor Paul gave us an idea for this series and we started studying, was when is the last time a public letter like that would have been written that would say something to the effect of, if we want to grow, if we want to attract people, if we want to gain favor with the people around us, we need to look and act more like the Christians. Because that's what's going on. In his book, The Rise of Christianity, Stark says there's lots of different things that happen and that helped cause Christianity to grow. Sometimes we think it's the miracles, right? These miraculous moments, and certainly there are documented miracles that happened during that time that helped Christianity come upon the scene. And sometimes we think it's the worship services that gathered and people were intrigued by what was happening. They wanted to come, they wanted to be a part of that and kind of figure out what's going on. But what Stark says is what consistently throughout history, what we see, the reason Christianity exploded from a little group of fishermen, of Galileans, of Judeans, that really didn't have a whole lot of formal education, that really hadn't experienced the world very far beyond where they lived. The reason that small band blew up to the point that a couple hundred years later, Christianity was affirmed as the official religion of Rome, was because of the way they treated one another and the people around them. That Christianity thrived because of the love that they showed each other and the love they showed people that didn't look like them, that didn't live like them, that didn't believe like them. And the fact is, in the church today, we are a church of diversity, right? There are people here today that don't look like you, right? Turn to the person next to you and say, I'm thankful that you don't look like me. Right? It's okay. There's people that don't look like you. There's people that don't live like you. There's people that may come from a different socioeconomic status, that they have different cultural beliefs. There may even be in this room people that don't politically agree with you. That was the nervous laughter, right? He was funny earlier. Now he's making me nervous. But what we find is that Christianity across the board, whether we read from those letters or we read from the New Testament, has been built on an ethic of love. That when we encounter the love of God, it changes us. And in John's letter to the church, he explains what this looks like. In 1 John, this is what he says. He says, and so we know and rely on the love that God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God is in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. And there is no fear in love, because perfect love casts out, drives out, pushes away fear. Because fear has to do with punishment, with judgment, and the one who fears has not yet been made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates their brother and sister is a liar, and God is not in them. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they can see cannot love God, whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and their sister. He says that our ethic is built on an ethic of love, that our actions are built on actions of love. And that because we have encountered God, things change. Because when we encounter God, we encounter what love truly is. And he says that we are able to love one another because he loved us first. And when we experience love, life looks different. Maybe the first time I realized this, I was a counselor at a junior high camp. And this group of junior high boys came in. And their mothers came to me. And they said, are you their counselor? And I said, yes. And they begged and pleaded. They said, please make sure they take showers. They're just, right? They just, please. And I was like, look, I can't promise that. You know, I'm not in charge of the hygiene here. You know, I don't know. And I watched over the first 3 days as these boys did, as junior high boys often do, right? They went and they played and they sweat and they stunk and they either stayed in the same clothes or put on new clothes that did not matter because the aroma was strong. Right? And I'll never forget about the third day in. I was getting ready for chapel and I walk by the door and I hear a commotion in the bathroom. And I want to make sure like something crazy not happening. They're on there giving each other swirlies or something. So I open the door and there is a haze in the room. All right? And at first I thought it was like that pig pen from Charlie Brown haze, right? Like they had so many stinky boys had gotten together that you just couldn't see through the filth anymore. But I realized as I walked in that I smelled something, and it was a smell that I recognized. It was the smell of Axe body spray. And as I pushed through the haze, I saw this line of boys, each with a can in each hand, just going, you know, they are going to town. I'm like, what is going on? And I look, and some of the fog had come from the fact that these boys had finally miraculously taken showers. And I looked and there was a couple of them, right? They were leaning into the mirror, they had shaving cream on, and they were taking care of that one hair on their face, right? And I'm like, guys, what happened? And one of them turns to me and he says, Aaron, we met a girl. Now, I'm sure if you're like me, you can see the logistical problems of we met a girl. But they had cleaned, so I wasn't going to say a thing. And I look, and I'll never forget, I look at the guy, and he's at the very end, and he turns to me, and he says, Aaron, do you think I'm in love? And I went, yes, I do, yeah. That's nothing else but love could make this happen, right? Nothing else could take a stinky junior high boy and have him shave his face and spray Axe cologne, right? There's no way. Love changes things. When we have an encounter with love, real love, true love, life looks different forever. And love's been getting a bit of a bad rap. If we're not careful when we talk about love, we sort of describe it as this sappy, romantic, sensational feeling, the butterflies that we may have and that's not what we're talking about today. Nor are we talking about what the world sort of casts forth as love, where if you love me, you'll let me do what I want. If you love me, you'll let me be who I want to be. If you love me, you'll give me whatever it is I desire, no matter the consequences. That's not love either. Love is not some sort of romantic feeling, the sort of sappy, swoony songs that we talk, nor is it this allowance to do whatever it is that makes me happy. Love is so much better than that. It is so much more than that. And we encounter love at its very foundation, at its most core, when we encounter Jesus. We see what love looks like. And what Jesus says is, when you've encountered me, if you've met me, your life should reflect that. Now listen, today is a bit of an in-house sermon, right? There may be some of you here today who you aren't a believer, or you're sort of skeptical about some of the claims that the church makes. You're still figuring stuff out. What my hope for you is that you, throughout these 3 weeks, we'll see what the church should be, what the church could be, and what the church will be. But for those of us that are Christ followers, for those of us that call ourselves Christians, when we encounter Jesus and start to follow him, we follow him with our lives, which means we start to love those around us because he first loved us. And Jesus takes his group of disciples in his last meal with them. It's the last time that Jesus is going to be able to teach them anything. And he starts to explain that he's going away. And we find this in the Gospel of John, chapter 13. This is what he says. He says, "My children, I will be with you only a little while longer. You will look for me, but just as I have told the Jews, I will now tell you, where I'm going, you cannot come. But a new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know you are my disciples, if you love one another." Jesus is saying they will know that we are Christians by our Facebook posts, right? See, if we're not careful, we sort of buy into a gospel that is less than what Jesus has presented us with. And if we're not careful, we buy into a system that doesn't fully reach the levels that Christ expects for us and from us. See, we think that it's our job, if we're not careful, that really our job is to make a stand, right? That we it's time for us to stand up and just let the world know how it is. If you're not protesting something, are you really even a Christian? Now, I'm thankful I didn't grow up in this culture, but I had a lot of friends that did. My dad was my pastor, and so as a church, I sort of missed a lot of some of the unhealthy things that I've seen happen. But I had a lot of friends that went in a lot of different places, and I would be like, hey, we should go watch this. And they'd be like, I can't. We're against that. And I'd be like, why? And they'd be like, I don't know. And they'd be like, what about this? No, we can't do that. We can't eat there. We can't go to that place. We can't buy from them. I distinctly remember my neighbors protesting Cabbage Patch dolls. And I don't know why. I don't know, maybe because they were like organically grown babies, which, come to think of, it's a little weird. Okay, I get it. Right, but we started to think that being a Christian was about being against something. And we bought into this idea that as long as we say true things loudly, the world's gonna change. And it doesn't matter how we say it or who we're saying it to. We just have to sort of speak forth correct information. We think that becoming a church or an organization, and I've seen this happen. Now, I'm thankful I have not seen this at Victory, right? These are churches in other places that you've never heard of, that you've never been to, denominations that you don't know about, all right? Like it's not that one. No, okay? Stop trying. It's not that one either. These aren't ones, all right? I'm not pointing anyone out, but what they've decided is, as a church, our job is to take a position and make a point instead of making a difference. And what I found often is places that care about taking a position and making a point, and places that care about making a difference are quite often not the same place. See, people were always trying to get Jesus to take a stand, to make a point, take a position on this. And we like positions because they're easy. They're black and white. You make a point and you stand on it. And it sort of alleviates us of the messiness of living with one another. But the fact is, Jesus consistently was around people and hung out with people. Everywhere Jesus went, people disagreed with him. I mean, have you noticed that? Everywhere Jesus goes, people are asking him questions. I mean, even within the disciples, you see this happening. That Peter does this all the time. I love Peter. You guys know that. Peter's my favorite disciple because I see a lot of me in Peter. Peter's loud, right? Peter talks fast. I think Peter talks fast. You may not see him that way. That's fine. I need wrong people in my life. Peter talks fast, right? Peter doesn't have a filter. He says things without thinking. He doesn't know what's going to happen next, right? He doesn't have a wife that's standing next to him telling him, don't say that, baby. Don't say that. I think Peter got fired a lot. I think Peter lost his job because he said stupid things. And then the last thing I feel that most connected with Peter's stupid, man. He just says dumb things. And I look at Peter and I'm like, if he can be a disciple, so too can I. And there's a time when Jesus is telling disciples what's going to happen. And Peter says, kind of takes Jesus aside, and the language says he actually chastises Jesus like a child. He disagrees with Jesus. Even in the inner circle, there was disagreement happening. Do you know how I know this? Because of the people that Jesus picked to be his disciples. There's a passage in Luke where we start naming off the disciples. And here's who it names. It names Matthew. Keep on to that one. It's going to be important. Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who's called the Zealot. Now, the first person is Matthew. This is what we know about Matthew. Matthew is a tax collector. There's a group of people that the Jews hate. There's a few groups. They hate the Samaritans, they hate the Romans, and they hate tax collectors. And the reason they hate tax collectors is because tax collectors are raising money for the Romans. And the Romans are oppressing the Jews. The Romans have taken away the blessing that God promised them. They've changed the way temple worship happens. They've made them do things they don't want to do. They're taking them places they don't want to be. They're not letting them rule themselves. And Rome is number one on the most hated list for Israel and for the Jewish culture. And here's what happens. Certain Jews decided that they were going to use the oppressors to make money. And so they became tax collectors, and they're funding the hated Romans. And not only that, but they had to make some money. So they would charge you more than your normal tax. So if you said, hey, I owe $100, and they'd say, well, actually, I'm going to have to take $2. And they would pocket $100 and they would give the rest to Rome. They were hated individuals because they were supporting the Roman culture and government that was oppressing the Jews. Then you have the last person called Simon the Zealot. Zealots were individuals who hated Rome more than even your normal Jew. Zealots wanted to start a revolution. They wanted to take over. They didn't want to heal Rome. They wanted to destroy it. Later on in culture, we find there's a group called the dagger zealots who would literally hide knives in their cloaks. And if they saw a Roman citizen or Roman soldier alone, they would kill them. That's how badly they hated Rome. And Jesus calls a tax collector who is supporting the Roman culture, financing the Roman oppression, and a zealot who wants to destroy everything about Rome, and he brings them in as his disciples. And not only that, you know what else he does? When Jesus starts to send the disciples out 2 by 2, you want to guess which two he puts together? The tax collector and the zealot. I think this is why Jesus told them not to take anything with them. Can I take a sword? No. No. How about a stick? Can I bring a sandal? I'm not sure. How thick is it? These guys hate each other. They totally disagree politically about what the world should look like. And they're both convinced that God is on their side. One thinks that God has sent Rome to punish the Jews for what they have done, and so they're going to make money off of that punishment. The other thinks that Rome is stealing the blessing, and we need to do everything we can to take them down. And Jesus calls both of them, sits them together, and have you noticed that he never makes a point of trying to decide which one's right? There's never a time we read where Jesus is like, well, really, Matthew, I only brought you here to humiliate you in front of everyone else. You're an idiot. I cannot believe you're funny. He doesn't say, Simon, you warmonger, I'm a person of peace and love. Put down, why are you going out and trying to destroy Rome, man? This is part of the plan. He doesn't do that. He simply keeps the tension of two individuals that disagree with one another, but both want to follow Jesus. And this happens all the time. Because Jesus relationally leans in to those who need him the most. And what I have found is those who look the least like Jesus like him the most. You see, you have the Pharisees that look a lot like Jesus. Let's be honest. Theologically, they agree. The Pharisees, they studied scripture. They understood what it meant to be holy. They understood that God had promised them things. They tried to live a life within the set of rules because rules are neat and rules are clean. And the reality is Jesus looks a lot like them. Theologically, he probably believes a lot like them. They knew who God was. They knew the Old Testament. They knew the Torah and the stories of God and the people of Judaism. So did Jesus. They went to the festivals like a good Jew. So did Jesus. Countless stories in the New Testament are Jesus going to the synagogue, going to the temple, going to the festivals. When the woman reaches out and grabs his cloak to be healed, that's a prayer shawl that he's holding. That's a typical holy Jewish thing. He looks a lot like these guys, but they don't like him very much. And they're constantly trying to trap him. They're like the internet trolls of the day. They're constantly trying to get him to take a stand, to answer their questions. And if you read through the New Testament, you'll find Jesus almost never answers their questions with an answer. Have you ever noticed that? Jesus almost always comes back with another question because Jesus isn't about taking a position and making a point. So that they come in and say, whoa, what do you think about that, Jesus? And he'd be like, well, have you thought of this? And then they come to him this one time, they say, Jesus, what do you think we should pay taxes? And they think they have him trapped because none of the Jews wanted to pay taxes. And if he said yes, he was going to lose his Jewish followers. But Rome would arrest anyone who said you didn't have to pay taxes as treason. So either Jesus was going to say, yes, you should pay taxes, and he was going to lose his Jewish followers, or he's going to say, no, you don't have to pay taxes, and he was going to get arrested by Rome. And Jesus goes, does anyone have a coin? And he grabs a coin and he shows it to him and he says, whose face is on this coin? Question with a question. And they say, Caesar, because culturally we know Caesar stamped his head on those coins. And Jesus goes, well, you know what? Give to Caesar what's Caesar and God's what's God's. Now notice he doesn't make a declaration of which one's which. He just says, this is what you should do. And he drops his mic and walks away. And all of the Pharisees are like, who asked that stupid question? Whose idea was that? You're not asking any more questions. This is over, right? And they hate Jesus. And they hate Jesus because Jesus looked like them, but leaned into people that didn't. He relationally showed up with individuals that needed him the most. Constantly, we're told in the New Testament that Jesus hangs out with tax collectors and sinners, right? Multiple times, women would come to him and they say, how could you let this sinful woman be near you? We know why they don't like the tax collectors. The Pharisees don't like them. We know that. And Jesus is eating with tax collectors. He's called a tax collector. We see it in Matthew. The Pharisees are upset. It says while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, who, by the way, is a tax collector. It says he was many other tax collectors and sinners came by, because that's what happens. You hang out with one, the rest of them show up. And the Pharisees take Jesus' disciples aside and they say, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now this phrase, when we hear it most often, we think tax collectors, we know what those are. And when we think of sinners, I think most of us think of just sort of this generic idea, right? That Jesus is hanging out with sinners, like me and you, right? People that just do dumb things and do things wrong. And while Jesus did hang out with that, that's not what the text is saying consistently. Now, see, he was a very specific type of sinner. If I was saying this in today's language, I would say something to the effect of Jesus is hanging out with tax collectors and women of the night. Now, most of us know what that means. It was a colloquial phrase. Jesus was hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors because no one would hang out with prostitutes and tax collectors but each other. And so Jesus would go to the tax collectors' houses, and of course, prostitutes would be there. And the Pharisees hated both. Now we know why they hated the tax collectors. Why did they hate the prostitutes? Might not be for why you think. You see, in Judaism, your line was passed through the mother. They didn't have DNA testing back then, right? You couldn't go on like Jerry Springer or Maury Povich and be like, survey says 98% chance you're a Jew, right? They didn't have those. There was no way of finding that out. And so what would happen is, if you had a non-Jewish mother and a Jewish father, you weren't considered Jewish because they couldn't prove that you were Jewish. But if you had a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, you were considered Jewish because they knew your mother was a Jew. And so what was happening is these prostitutes were going and they were sleeping with Roman soldiers, the hated, the oppressors, and they would get pregnant. And when they had a baby, the daughter or son of a hated Roman soldier was now grafted into the Jewish blessing. And so the prostitutes were really almost evangelizing. They were bringing in individuals that didn't look like they were supposed to look like, didn't act the way they were supposed to act. They were the hated oppressors, and they were allowing those individuals to be grafted into Judaism. And there is nothing that a Pharisee hates more than someone getting a blessing that they don't think deserves it. And they're livid with Jesus. And they keep trying to trip him up. And they keep trying to ask him questions. And what Jesus does is he goes and he leans in relationally to those who need him. He doesn't try to make a stand. He doesn't try to make a point. He makes a difference. And one of the things that I've loved about Victory of the last almost 2 years now, it's when I get to sit in staff meetings and talk with Pastor Paul about the things he wants to see happen. Or Vaughn and I sit down and discuss something, or Kurt and I are grabbing coffee, and we start to talk about what the church could be and should be, and will be. And there's been a conscious decision made to look like Jesus at Victory. That there will be times that we as individuals don't agree. There will be times when you as individuals don't agree with each other and maybe not even agree with us. And there's times that we see the news and we just want to vomit, or we see somebody on Facebook and we want to fix them. Maybe someday I'll get lucky enough to be put in as pastor of Facebook and I'll just fix everyone's theology and politics. We made a conscious decision that we're going to say truth, but we're going to do it differently. And we're going to talk about in a couple weeks what it looks like to speak truth with love. Because love is always the deciding factor. And it's because we've encountered God that we even know what love looks like. So we're going to finish today taking communion with one another. The ushers are going to come down at this point. They're going to hand out what we call the elements. It'll be a little piece of bread and a cup of juice. I'd ask you, if you're seeking after God today, if you consider yourself a Christ follower, take one. You don't have to be a member here. But hold on to it, because we're going to all take them together. Because one of the things about communion is when we take communion, we're communing with God, but we're also communing with one another. You see, there may be someone down the road that you don't like very much. Don't look at them if they're there, but you know who I'm talking about. There may be someone that sits in another section that doesn't look like you, that doesn't believe like you do. I know this is hard for us, but there may be someone in this church that doesn't have the same political opinion as you. And we're going to commune together anyway, because that's what love does. And so when you take the cup and you take the piece of bread, there's a little cup as well with gluten-free options if you need that. But as you take it, be reminded that we're doing this together in unity with one another in love. And once everyone's been served, we'll take it together.